my name is Jess and welcome to my channel, Jess in Romancelandia, where I talk about romance books and happily ever afters and all the wonderful things that they entail. Today I thought I would film another instalment in my romance recommendation series, which is when I take a trope or a subgenre within romance and recommend things to you. So the trope that I've chosen to speak about today is enemies to lovers, which is one of my absolute favourite tropes, and it's actually one that whenever I see people talking about tropes or motifs that they love in romance books comes up again and again. It is a very, very beloved arc within romance novels and within novels that don't even have romance as a primary genre. A lot of times in fantasy and crime, I've noticed, the kind of romantic subplot will often follow a similar hate to love, enemies to lovers arc. So there's something about it that clearly resonates with readers. I would genuinely love to know what you guys think that resonance is, because if you think about it, like, most relationships in real life don't start out that way, so it can't be a relatability thing. Part of me wonders whether, because part of the enemies to lovers or hate to love journey is kind of growing to understand a person on a deeper level and see them in a new light, if that kind of transformation or revelation or deeper communication, to carry on adding words ending with Shen, maybe that is what draws people to it, the idea that it's a romance that requires for the layers of the characters to be peeled back so that they can learn to love each other and change their dynamic. I don't know, whatever it is though, I absolutely love it, so I'm really excited to share these recommendations with you guys today. I thought I would start doing something a bit new with recommendations videos, however. So there are lots of books out there that I think are good, are decent, but that I haven't necessarily rated higher than like 3 stars just because they're not my favourite thing, but that I think I didn't rate higher not because of any sort of stylistic issues or content issues, but just because they're not my kind of thing. So I thought I'd sort of start with an honorary mentions of books that I personally wasn't blown away by because they're just not my style, but that do feature the enemies to lovers tropes and that therefore I think you guys could like. So in terms of honourable recommendations, first up we have the novels of LJ Shen. I've mentioned her books here on this channel before and I do really enjoy LJ Shen's books. They're very like dark, borderline dark romance, I'd say. They're not necessarily dark, it depends on the one that you pick up, but quite often the dynamics are ones that are very fraught, I would say. She's quite well known for like a brand or a subsection of alpha hero that is known in the romance community as alpha holes, because their alpha male behaviour kind of extends into arsehole-ish behaviour, which is where some of my frustration comes in, but I can't deny that they are very addictive books. Once you've read one you kind of want to read them all, and so the ones that I think reflect most strongly that enemies to lovers theme are Vicious and The Kiss Thief. She definitely has some others in there. I think she's got some newer releases that are enemies to lovers. I think she might have one that is my personal favourite enemies to lovers nuance, which is Friends to Enemies to Lovers. I love all that angst. But yeah, these two are a good place to start with LJ Shen. Another honourable mention that I thought I would flag up if you guys want to go and have a look is Enemies by Shen. Again, this kind of falls into the Latin nuance that I mentioned of childhood friends to enemies to lovers, which I really like just because I think that there is already that depth of connection between the protagonists, and getting to understand how that connection has come to be is one of the joys of reading that dynamic. So yes, it wasn't my favourite book, hence why it's not in the main list, but I think that Shen is an incredibly prolific author. She is very much loved within the romance genre, and so you guys should check this out if it's something that you would be interested in. And the final honourable mention that I have is Room Hate by Penelope Ward. I believe again this follows kind of former friends to enemies to lovers, as they are both granted ownership of a property despite their feud, and they kind of have to unpack that feud and learn to live with each other whilst literally living with each other in the same property. With this one I remember finding the hero really annoying, but that was really the only thing I had against it. Again, Penelope Ward is so loved by so many people, which is why I wanted to do this sort of honourable mentions thing, because I don't want you guys to miss out on books that you could love just because, I don't know, aspects of it didn't necessarily resonate with me. Anyway, so those are kind of my honourable mentions, and now going into the main list I've decided to structure it in a slightly unusual way, and that's because I think enemies to lovers can cover a really extensive scale. You know, on the one hand we kind of have those sort of innocent rivalries where like they don't like each other, they're not each other's favourite person, but it'll be difficult to call them enemies because there's no real, you know, pain there. And then you kind of like graduate up the scale to, oh no, there are some genuine misdoings in the past, and then you kind of reach the kind of very intense end of the enemies to lovers scale, which is like, you know, separate sides of a war, murder has been done, blood has been spilled, grudges have been built up over many a year. You know, like, it's a big scale that we're talking about, so I'm going to kind of start with the more gentle enemies to lovers and then end with the I don't know how they're ever going to get over this and get from the enemies to lovers books. So starting at the lower end of the scale, we are going with Married by Morning by Lisa Kleypas. I've spoke about this book on this channel before because I absolutely love it. It is my favourite Lisa Kleypas that I've read to date, and it's definitely my favourite of the Hathaway series, which this book is a part of. It revolves around a group of siblings, the Hathaway siblings, who come into a title and a property and have to rebuild it despite being regarded as very zany and out of place by like Le Bon Ton, the Upper 10,000, that kind of thing. So this one follows Catherine Marks, who is the governess of the two younger Hathaway children, and the difficult relationship that she has with the eldest of the Hathaway siblings and the only boy, Leo. So these guys don't really get along, firstly because they both have kind of secrets and a bit of shame around their past, and I think they sense that in each other throughout the series, but then also because they are just polar opposites in terms of personality. You have Catherine, who is very bookish, very sensible, very aware of propriety, and then you have Leo, who is like a former rake, doesn't really care about propriety, is trying to build his life up and become a better person, but definitely has some, you know, morally grey moments popping up here and there. So the dynamic is one that I'd classify as enemies to lovers because they have some doozies of arguments. But I do think that it's kind of a more heartwarming enemies to lovers because, you know, there is that care between them from the beginning. Catherine does know that Leo loves his siblings so that he's not a straight up villain, and Leo does know that Catherine is just trying her best to get through the world any way that she can. So watching them come together is, you know, you can see how it's going to happen from the beginning, but watching them negotiate that and all the little spats they have along the way is just really fun. So the next recommendation I have, we're moving up a step on the enemies to lovers scale to a competitive professional rivalry with From Lukov with Love by Mariana Zapata. Mariana Zapata is also a very well-known contemporary romance novelist. A lot of her books are on Kindle Unlimited, and she's known for writing very slow burn romances, which I think suit the enemies to lovers mold really well because I don't know, when enemies just turn to lovers too quickly, it feels very jarring, whereas I feel that because Mariana Zapata has that slow burn edge to her words anyway, that evolution of a relationship is a lot more believable. So From Lukov with Love follows Jasmine, who is a professional figure skater, as she is forced to team up to pair skate with her rival and the older brother of her best friend, Ivan Lukov. These two are both just very sassy, very confident, very no nonsense, and whilst you think that would mean that they'd get along, it also leads to a lot of butting of heads, especially in the first few chapters. That kind of, you know, sparking off each other doesn't fade as their relationship turns into friendship and then to romance, but that kind of like combative nature remains throughout and made it really enjoyable. I found their conversations were so full of chemistry and life and passion that it just made them really fun to read about, and I would highly recommend this one even if you know nothing about ice skating, because it's just a fun kind of wintry read. Okay, so for my third recommendation, we're moving another step up the enemies to lovers scale to the You Have Ruined My Life and I Hate You with The Worst Best Man by Mia Sosa. This book has such an enticing premise because it follows a very organised and respected and established wedding planner, Carolina Santos, who ironically is left at the altar. However, the reason that she is left at the altar is very personal, and it's just because her fiance's younger brother, Max, convinced his brother to leave her on the day of the wedding. So later, when external circumstances force Max and Carolina into spending more time with each other, tensions erupt, as do some unresolved feelings towards one another. I was really curious to see how Mia Sosa went about this novel, because on the one hand you do have the betrayal, Max's betrayal of Carolina, when he kind of uproots the life that she had with this man that she loved, but then you also have the fact that when their relationship does start to transform from those enemies to lovers, and she does start to forgive him, then you have a whole nother set of issues, which is the fact that Max is still her ex-fiance's brother, and how did they negotiate that? Because, you know, it's not a happy little family situation. Can you imagine how awkward their Christmas dinners are? Anyway, like everything that Mia Sosa writes, this is super charming, super well handled, super clever, because Mia Sosa knows the contemporary romance novel genre so well, and she works that genre every single time, and I absolutely love this. Okay, so for our next recommendation, we're moving up the enemies to lovers scale to the I will shoot you if you cross me with Lord of Scoundrels by Loretta Chase. This is an absolutely iconic historical romance novel. It's the sort of novel that if you turn to any historical romance author, even if they haven't read it, which they probably have, they definitely would have heard of it, because it is just credited with really changing the game when it comes to historical romance. This book is set in the late 1820s, I believe, and it follows Lord Dane, who is widely regarded as an immoral, rakish, libertine about town. Our heroine is a young woman named Jessica Trent who goes to confront Dane after he takes her brother carousing about town, and the two of them butt heads in a kind of fiery exchange of words that just continues to reverberate in both of their lives as they keep coming across each other's paths. I love this novel for a lot of reasons. You can definitely tell that it's of its time. It's a mid-90s novel. It is slightly different from the sort of historicals that we see coming out today, but it does so much important work for that subgenre. Jessica as a heroine, first of all, has a wonderful name, a la my own name, but she is also fierce and professional and no nonsense, and she's so sex positive. That was really radical for the time. She is actually the one out of her and Dane that is far more confident in sexuality and in passionate intimate acts, and it's just really enjoyable to read these kind of two very fiery personalities come together and kind of try and negotiate a relationship that shouldn't work. There is so much going against these two, and yet they manage to kind of overcome that initial animosity, overcome external circumstances, and have a really wonderful love story. And is that not what Enemies to Lovers is all about? Okay, so now we're getting into the more intense areas of the Enemies to Lovers romance with a You Are Literally Destroying My World with the book Pestilence by Laura Thalassa. This is the first book in the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse series, which literally follows the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse: pestilence, war, famine and death, as they come down one by one to kind of destroy the earth as we know it today. So Pestilence follows the first of the Four Horsemen to come down and start spreading disease and panic and death. Along his path of destruction, a woman named Sarah Burns steps in his path and tries to gun him down, only to be taken prisoner when he survives, as he is basically impossible to kill. I know that this sounds just mega intense, but I think it's worth noting that the concept of this series is basically the idea that every horseman meets someone that challenges their belief that humanity is just purely destructive and worth nothing, by kind of showing love, showing affection, showing how decent relationships, how human relationships are built up. So that is really the journey that we see Pestilence and Sarah go on throughout this book. That being said, their journey is not an easy one and is very firmly in the enemies section of Enemies to Lovers for a long time, because Sarah is not just going to fall at the feet of a guy that is spreading disease and illness, and he also isn't too fond of a human woman that tries to shoot him every time she can. However, the fact that by the end of this book I was actually really rooting for them as a couple just reveals how good a job Laura Thalassa does at unfolding this story and at really just developing the characters and their relationship at a pace that is, it still falls into that fantastical genre, but at the same time it feels fairly believable. The choices that Sarah is making feel understandable in the moment, and so I really enjoy this one. I think it is definitely one of the more extra Enemies to Lovers that you can come across in kind of urban fantasy, but it's a very enjoyable one. Next up, we're moving on to the book series that occupies the second most intense space on my Enemies to Lovers scale, which is basically we're on opposite sides of the war. You have killed people that I love, and now I'm going to keep you as my servant and torture you sometimes, with Captive Prince by C.S. Picard. I've spoken about this series so much on this channel that I really don't want to spend too much time speaking about it here, so I will link my review down below if you guys want to see more about it. I do have a spoiler-free section at the start for those of you that haven't seen it. I won't lie to you guys, the first book is very dark, and I will leave some trigger warnings below beneath the link to my review of it, just in case you guys don't want to go into that, which would be completely understandable. But for those of you that do feel able to read it, I will say that it is one of the most wonderful, creative, intelligent series that I've read in a long time, that I've read maybe ever. I think why this enemies to lovers arc works so well is, first of all, it's done very, very slowly. It happens over the course of 3 books, and over that course of 3 books you're learning so much about the characters and the situation and the mentalities that you do start to see how things have slotted into place and how certain perspectives that we are given access to will be misinterpreting things because of the information that's available to them. It's very clever, it's very mind trippy, and it's very rewarding if you stick with it. So yes, absolutely love Captive Prince, would highly recommend. And the final book on my enemies to lovers scale comes in at first place because of its whole I killed your loved ones and now you're torturing me vibe, and that is Call the Coroner by Avril Ashton. So this follows 2 men, Stavros, an assassin, and Daniel, the head of a mafia family. A few months prior to the start of this novel, Daniel's wife is assassinated by Stavros, who is hired out to kill her. Later on, Daniel captures Stavros, and the 2 men end up having this very intense, very psychologically twisted bond as he is held Daniel's prisoner. This book is interesting to me because I think it's the only one where by the end of the book I still didn't like either man. They are objectively bad people, like they commit crimes, they cause pain, but I think that the way that Avril Ashton writes their story is just fascinating, because even though I don't like them as people, I see why they work together. So it's bizarre. It's a really odd reading experience, but it's so intense and so dramatic and so horrifying at times that you just kind of end up getting dragged along with it. So yeah, if you guys are into like dark when it comes to your enemies to lovers romance, check out some Avril Ashton, because she is not afraid to go to some weird places. Okay, so there we have it. Those are all my enemies to lovers recommendations. As always, I would love to know if you guys have any more recommendations for me. Like I said, this is one of my all-time favourite tropes, and when it is done well, it is just... So yeah, please do let me know if there are any enemies to lovers books that I should be reading down in the comments, and also if there are any tropes that you would like to see me do in the future. A viewer in my last video commented and asked for kind of like a hurt comfort trope recommendation video, so that would definitely be coming up soon. But if there are any others that you guys would be interested in, please do let me know, because I really love making these videos. Until then though, thank you guys so much for watching, and goodbye!